Great to see everybody back here. So, Liv, why are they still looking at you?
What's that?
You still have the speaker view for some reason.
Oh, well, you can change that in your screen.
But also, if you mute Lev, you won't be in speaker anymore.
All right, good. All right, very good to be with you all, and I hope you had a nice Shavuot. I had a very interesting Shavuot. I'll tell you a word about. We had a tikkun here in my apartment and front garden with about 40 people all night, but I would say 100 people in and out. All of them what you would call refugees from Mea Shearim or Bnei Brak. I have been working in this visit in Israel with this population I've been very interested in for a long time. People who grew up in the Hasidic or other parts of the ultra-Orthodox world and then left for various ideological or personal reasons and have a very hard time finding the way back to Judaism. I've been working as a guide to those people and have become a little bit of a rebbe, you might say, for people who have in some ways lost their faith and are looking for something else. And that's been a very, very inspiring part of my time here. And a large number of them gathered at my house for Shavuot. I made it through till 5 o'clock in the morning, which is pretty good for an old guy, but I have been exhausted for the last 3 days since. So it's nice to be teaching again and being called upon to be awake, and I'm sure I will be. So with that, let's go to our texts. We have 2 texts for today. One from Parshat Tetzaveh and one from Parshat Ki Tisa, both of them coming from the latter part of the book of Exodus, the book of Exodus that deals so much with the building of the Mishkan and the details of the building of the tabernacle and so on. This first verse comes at the very end of Parshat Ki Tetzaveh. I want to read you the verse first, all in Hebrew. So look at the Hebrew section first. The verse reads, "V'yad'u ki ani Hashem Elohechem." They will know that I am Hashem, your God. Asher hotzeiti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim, l'shochni betocham. That's the phrase, especially when I look at l'shochni betocham. For my dwelling among them, for the sake of my dwelling within them, in order that I dwell within them. That word l'shochni that you see, l'shochni, that root shin kaf nun, is the same word as shechina. So that I place my shechina, that I place my presence among them. It's also the same word, same root as mishkan, that's the tabernacle, because mishkan means the place of shachan, the place of Shekhinah, the place where God dwells. So I brought them out of Egypt to dwell in their midst. I am Hashem, their God. Now let's look down at the English and see what I want to do with it. You might recognize that phrase, to dwell amid them, to dwell among them. I know of no other verse that so well summarizes the entire Torah narrative. That is why I have named this book for it. This book will be called To Dwell Within Them, from that verse. In English, I think to dwell within them sounds good. In Hebrew, l'shochni betocham is a little hard for non-Israelis to pronounce. So we'll have to see if I use that title in Hebrew, but I think I will. For Israelis, it's fine. L'shochni betocham. That's why I've named the book for it. I think this verse summarizes what the Torah is about. So they will know that I am Hashem, their God, who brought them forth to the land of Egypt, that I might dwell amid them, or that I might dwell within them. I am Hashem, their God. God brought us out of Egypt, liberating us from human bondage, so that we would constitute an earthly dwelling place for divinity. So that we would constitute an earthly dwelling place for divinity. That was the purpose of our liberation. I want to go back to that word mishkan. Mishkan is a dwelling place. The mem at the beginning of that noun is a mem that stands for a place of. It's something like makom shel. So you would say, for example, mikdash is a place of holiness. Makom is a place of existence. Let me think of another word. Mishteh is a place where you drink, and so on. The mem is a noun. The mem is a kind of what called a locative mem. The mem is a sort of a noun that announces the location. But here it's so that we would constitute an earthly dwelling place for divinity. In other words, I'm saying that we are the Mishkan. L'shochni b'tocha means that we are God's Mishkan. That's our purpose. That's what God decided Israel would be. A Mishkan for divine presence, a dwelling place. We were chosen not because we are better or smarter, not because God likes us better, or because he fell in love with our ancestor and made a promise. We were liberated and brought to the foot of Mount Sinai to become an earthly home for the Shekhinah. To become an earthly home for the Shekhinah. That's a tall order. That's a tall order to be an earthly home for the Shekhinah. Notice I don't say the earthly home for the Shekhinah, but an earthly home for the Shekhinah. I don't think we are the only one. But to be an earthly home for the Shekhinah has something to do with the way we love one another. It has something to do with the way we treat one another. It has something to do with the kind of ethical character of our community. And of course, it has everything to do with awareness that the Shekhinah is present, that the divine is present within us. To become a home for the Shekhinah is a kind of living a self-conscious religious life, where you're thinking of yourself as a person who embodies a home for divinity. I believe this to be the purpose of Jewish existence throughout the generations. We continue to exist because of it. I'm going to stop there. We continue to exist because of it. This task of making a Mishkan, you can say that Shabbat is a kind of Mishkan also. Heschel, remember, referred to the Sabbath as a palace in time. So it's a Mishkan. We make a Mishkan for God on every Shabbat and Chag that we celebrate together. But we are a Mishkan for God also in the way we live in the world and act in the world on weekdays, on ordinary days. Now here I get a little bit political, as you will be able to tell, but I think you won't be utterly surprised by any of it. This is as true of modern Israel as it was of ancient Israel. There's a continuity of Israel. Israel is the Jewish people. When I say Israel, I don't mean the state here, I mean the Jewish people. We are Am Yisrael. So it's as true of modern Israel, the modern Jewish people, as it was of ancient Israel, those who stood at the foot of the mountain. The 2/3 of us who were not slaughtered in the Holocaust were redeemed for a purpose, to become such a Mishkan, both in the Holy Land and in a dispersion. Were redeemed for a purpose. I don't mean to say, please don't misunderstand me, I don't mean to say there is a God who manipulates history and therefore God said it's okay for 2/3 of the Jews to be killed. I'm signing off on that one, but I'm going to redeem this third. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that as human history unfolded, as the unbelievable wickedness of human beings was revealed in those years, 1/3 of us were spared. I think we have to find meaning in that fact. I think we have to find meaning in the fact that 1/3 of the Jewish people survived, that we were not wiped out as our enemies hoped we would be. And that meaning for me is that we again become such a Mishkan, that we create a community which is a dwelling place of the divine presence, both in the Holy Land and in our dispersion. We have, since the Holocaust, a freedom to do that we've not had in a very long time. We live in a very, very rare period of Jewish history. Nowhere in the world is anyone being persecuted by a government for the crime of being a Jew. Once more, nowhere in the world are any Jews being persecuted by a government for the crime of being a Jew. This may be the first period in 17 or 1800 years that's true. Once the last Jews left Syria, and a few other places you can think of. There's nobody who's that. There's still anti-Semites in the world. There are plenty of private anti-Semites in the world. I'm not at all naive about that. But there's no place we can say a government is persecuting people because they are Jewish. That's still a very rare event in history. 2/3 of us were slaughtered in the Holocaust. The 2/3 of us who were not slaughtered in the Holocaust were redeemed for a purpose, to become such a mishkan, both in the Holy Land and in our dispersion. We now have an opportunity, both because we rule in Eretz Yisrael and because we are free, independent citizens in the diaspora, to create such a community. Nobody is stopping us, except ourselves, of course. Because if we look at Jewish life, it's hard to say it's a mishkan for the Shekhinah. But this immediately takes us back to the theme of brothers. Have we learned from the latter 4 books of the Torah to solve the problem that Heschel taught us was the key question of Genesis? Somewhere toward the end of Genesis, I quote Heschel, where I say, Heschel says, that's the question of the Torah. Genesis sets out the question, how can I live side by side with my brothers? The whole book of Genesis, from Cain and Abel, sons of Noah, Isaac and Ishmael, even Abraham and Lot to some extent, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers. How do I live with my brother? How can I live with my brother? Then Heschel said the last 4 books of the Torah are an answer to that question. The Torah is supposed to give me rules for living with my brother, a way of living with my brother, a way of creating a peace between my brother and myself. We are back in the land of Israel to test whether we can live side by side with brothers from whom we have been away so long. Those of us in America are here to be brothers to a great variety of people. But surely there's a special mission to offer brotherhood to another people who are struggling mightily to recover from a slavery that we should understand. How are we all doing in building such a mishkan of brotherhood, sisterhood? Yeah, the mishkan has to be welcoming. The mishkan is a tent. The flaps go up and you welcome people in like Abraham's tent. And how are we doing at being welcoming? I think about my friends who are activists for the sake of African refugees in Israel. I think about all kinds of questions that come up about living with one's brother. One's sometimes angry, unhappy, oppressed brother. One's sometimes so depleted by victimhood that he's not easy to live next door to, brother. But the Mishkan still requires that. But this is true of the individual as well. Hashem delivers you from all your Egypts, from all those forces that oppress and constrict you in both body and soul for a single purpose. Havaya longs to dwell within you, for you to become a Mishkan, radiating the light of divine blessing to those all around you, to brothers and sisters near and far away. So yes, I think the Jewish people has this task of being a Mishkan. Then in some ways, it's an exemplary task. It means if we could create a life in our community that appeared to people as being a Mishkan for God, a dwelling place for God, then we would pass that idea on to other people to create such communities. Remember, the holy is always exemplary. It's always exemplary to show you about what to do with the rest of life, what to do with the rest of the world, how to sanctify everything. And in the life of the individual, we have this task of being a Mishkan, that welcomes people in and shares light with people. So I do see a great specialness about a sense of the mission of Israel. Yes, I believe the Jewish people does have a mission in the world. And we did dedicate ourselves at Sinai, whether you call it take Sinai literally or take it metaphorically. We did dedicate ourselves at Sinai to becoming such a Mishkan. And we are still charged with it. Of course, if you think about that Mishkan, I think we can go back to the group now, Marilyn. If we think about that Mishkan, thanks. If we think about that Mishkan, I think we are still going to have to say it can't be built the same way in every generation. The Yitzchak Verditchev already said that the Israelites were obliged to build the Mishkan in exactly the way they did for their generation, but each generation has to build it in its own way. So the kind of Mishkan, the kind of religious community, you might say, or spiritual community we want to create, has to be one appropriate to the 22nd century. 22nd, this is the 21st century, the 21st century. And be thinking about what the proper Mishkan will look like in the 22nd century. But that's the evolving nature of such things. I like the image of the Mishkan. I've always liked the image of the Mishkan much better than the image of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple. Maybe it's because I'm a diaspora Jew. I've seen a lot of Israelis here who like to go up to the Temple Mount and think that the holiness of the Temple Mount is terribly important to them, and they feel they have to demonstrate that all the time. I rather like the idea of the Mishkan because it folds up. It folds up and you take it with you. It can be anywhere. You never know. We're reading in this week's Parsha Ba'alotcha about sometimes the cloud stayed over the Mishkan for a day and then it disappeared. Then it moved on and they had to pack up the whole Mishkan and move. Sometimes it would be there for a week, sometimes a month, sometimes a whole year. Until the cloud moved, Israel couldn't move. And you never knew. It was a life of not knowing whether you were moving and packing everything up the next day or staying for a year. It must have been very disconcerting. But then you say, well, maybe our lives are that way too. We never know. We never know if we have a year to stay in the particular situation we're in, or whether it's going to change dramatically and overnight, whether and what that change might be. So being prepared for it, being detached enough to the particular things we're doing, so that we can move on if we have to, if we're called to, is important. So that sense that the Mishkan can be folded and unfolded and go with you wherever you want. Of course, that was in some ways parallel to the great shift when the temple was destroyed. In the century when the second temple was destroyed, something very interesting happened. This is an insight of the late Jacob Neusner, an important Talmud scholar in our generation. Neusner said, in the century before the temple was destroyed, if you look at most of the laws we have that survive, that are attributed to people who lived in that century, they are about ritual purity, about who can eat with who can sit with whom to eat, and various other states of ritual purity, which would keep you in or out of the temple, which would allow you to enter the temple or not. In the century after the temple was destroyed, we have greatest number of laws of Shabbat, because they were learning in a religion whose central institution had been vanquished and wiped out. They were learning to create a new central institution, which was portable, which was Shabbat. And in that sense, Shabbat goes back to the Mishkan. Shabbat becomes the central institution of Jewish life. What defines a Jew, to a very large extent, for a very long time, was Shabbat. You're a participating member of the traditional Jewish community if you're a Shomer Shabbat. Yes. When my grandmother asked which butcher could be trusted to be kosher, she didn't ask, does he believe that the Torah came from Mount Sinai? Or does he believe so and so? She asked, is he a Shomer Shabbos? If he's a Shomer Shabbos, you could trust that his meat would be kosher, because that meant he was an upstanding member of the traditional Jewish community. And that was the going back to the Mishkan, because you remember the 39 forms of labor that are forbidden on Shabbat are the 39 forms of labor that were necessary for constructing the Mishkan. So they just took the positive and switched it around and went from Mishkan to Shabbat as a central institution. Shabbat becomes the new Mishkan. So that's one way. The centrality of Shabbat is one way in which I think Israel are a Mishkan, are a dwelling place for the divine presence in the world. I think that gift of Shabbat is a terribly important one for us to share with the world in this particular generation. I believe we should be missionary about Shabbat. I don't think we should be missionary about converting people to Judaism. I think we should be missionary about the idea of Shabbat. People need a day to turn off the devices, not to be slaves to our new master, the computer, not to be slaves to the commercial culture in which we live. I say, if you want to keep a Shabbat for today, in the Torah, there are only two forms of labor that are specifically forbidden on Shabbos. They're all the 39 that are derived from the Mishkan, but there are two things that are explicitly forbidden by the Torah on Shabbos: gathering sticks and lighting a fire. That's work in the Stone Age. That's work in the Stone Age. Gathering sticks and lighting a fire, those must be very ancient, because the Torah was after the Stone Age, it was the Bronze Age. But there was still that memory of that's what work is, gathering sticks and lighting a fire. In the digital age, in our age, I say, it's opening the device and opening your wallet. Those are the two things to stay away from on Shabbat. If you can put away our devices and put away our credit cards and cash, then I think we can create a meaningful Shabbat, kind of stripped down Shabbat observance, living without the devices and without spending. So that's my Shabbat Russia for today. But going back to the Mishkan, I'd like to hear what you have to say about this sense of the Jewish people as a container for God in the world, as a place for the divine presence. And what does it make unfair demands on us? Can we give up to those demands? Is it unrealistic in a time when the Jews have returned to political reality and have a state to make this demand of being an embodiment of the divine presence? Does one contradict the other? As some of the ultra-Orthodox said, you could never have a Jewish state because then you can't be an embodiment of God's presence. You're too mired in politics. So you better stay out of the statehood business. Jews aren't made for statehood. Or do we say there is a way of having a Jewish state and yet Jewish life is still an embodiment of the divine presence? Or does that become unrealistic? And how about in your individual lives? What might this model mean of an embodied presence of God, of you thinking of the body, thinking of yourself as a mishkan, that you are there to contain something that is beyond yourself. We are a mishkan, but God's presence wants to dwell among us. It is somehow a transcendent presence, and yet we need to make room for it in our lives. So that gives you a few things to think about, talk about, I hope.
Well, we have a lot of great questions. Are you ready?
Sure, fire away.
Okay. Given all the problems we face in our country, in Israel, and in the world, being a Mishkan can be overwhelming. How might we pare it down to make this idea accessible for each of us?
Yes, I think it is overwhelming, and I think it's meant to overwhelm us. I think it's meant to overwhelm us. Ki gavar aleinu chasdo, gavar aleinu is sort of overwhelmed us. Yes. Do we have to pare down the demand to be a mishkan, or can we pare down other things we do that allow us to be? So I think I want us to be asking ourselves, if my home is to be a mishkan for the divine presence, what do I have to do to make my home that? If my synagogue, those of you who go to synagogues or belong to synagogues, if my synagogue is to be a mishkan for the divine presence, what does it need to do to get there? I think much of that might have to do with how well people get along with each other in those homes or those synagogues. And then I think you might ask the bigger question about the Jewish people and the Jewish state. What do we have to do if this is to be, yes, spiritually valuable, spiritually significant, that there is a Jewish state, a spiritually significant model for the world that there is a Jewish state? What does the Jewish state have to do to be able to begin to live up to that? I know it's never all or nothing in these things, and present mishkan for the presence of God can be really overwhelming. But I think what steps do we take along the way is really what I'm asking.
What about the universal aspects of this? Doesn't the divine dwell in all people and creatures? How do you reconcile the specific Jewish story with the universal perspective? Are we meant to be leaders in this? Then why us?
I don't know why us. We made the decision a long time ago. Please understand, I do not know a God who chooses one people over another. I don't believe in that. But I think we decided in our very ancient history, and that's what the Torah records, that we stood at Mount Sinai and declared ourselves a holy people. I know it says God said it, but I don't know a God who speaks in words. So I think we, at that encounter with God that is represented by the Sinai story, whether it happened at that particular mountain in the wilderness or whether it happened over 100 years of something, I don't know. But we came away from the Torah with a sense that, yes, we had chosen to define our national existence as embodying the presence of God. That's what we said. And I think we believed it, and it kept us going for a long time. Are there other peoples like that? I hope so. I hope so. I want there to be other peoples like that. I can't know that existentially because I'm fully involved in this covenant, in this community. But I hear the Tibetans think of themselves the same way. And I hear the Americans think of themselves as a community, as a nation dedicated to democratic values and equality. Hey, that sounds great. I'm glad to know there are other people dedicated to important things. And I wish all those people were acting according to what they're dedicated to, supposedly, and us too. In other words, I think we are not just a natural ethnic community, like the Romanians or the Albanians. They have a land, they have a language, they have common ancestors. I think we are something else. Because I think we are a nation, we are an ethnic community, but we are a nation that committed ourselves to a life of holiness. Now you will say there are lots of secular, completely secular Jews who are not interested in this conversation at all. Are they not Jews? Are they bad Jews? I don't judge who's a good Jew and who's a bad Jew. Of course, they are Jews as far as I'm concerned. They're part of Am Yisrael. I don't work to exclude anybody from Am Yisrael. But if you ask me, why is there an Am Yisrael? Why is there a Jewish people? Why should there be a Jewish people in the world? I think it's because of this dedication to holiness, that we have something to offer the world. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Okay. In contemporary terms, how can we tell if the cloud has moved or if our ego nature is telling us to move on?
It's a great question. And there's no easy answer to it. There's no easy answer to it. Sometimes you get a great inner feeling, it's time for me to move on in my life. It's time for me to end this marriage. It's time for me to change this job. It's time for me to go back to school. Big things. Time for me to move out of my parents' house at the age of 55. You know, there are things. It's sometimes you get those messages, and knowing when to listen to them and when not to. Because is that an inner sacred voice that's speaking, or is that a voice of selfishness that's speaking? I want more, I could have more pleasure if I do it the other way. It'd be easier for me to do it the other way. Are you considering the other people, like the children of that marriage, or the parents who are being left alone, or whatever it is? Those aren't easy questions. I don't mean to say there's only one right answer. But I think we do have inner voices, and we have to learn to listen to them with discernment. Sometimes we say no to them because of other things we know. But I think there are inner voices that tell us this. Sometimes it's time to move ahead. It's time to make a change.
I'm curious about the associations our tradition has with the Shekhinah image of God. Perhaps, I'm not quite sure I get this, but let me start again. I'm curious about the associations our tradition has with the Shekhinah image of God to your conception about the meaning of the Mishkan.
Yes, let me say a little bit about Shekhinah. Shekhinah is a word that's been around for a very long time. It goes back to the earliest rabbinic sources, 2nd, 3rd century. We already have Zaza Shekhinah Miakot Ma'aravi, the Shekhinah never left the Western Wall, and things like that. The word Shekhinah is there. The word Shekhinah in rabbinic Hebrew is a way of talking about the divine presence when you don't want to say God. You don't want to say God because it's too familiar. You're talking about God's presence in the world. And you want to make sure you're defending a notion of divine transcendence, where God is something beyond the world. Therefore, when you talk about God being present in the world, use the word Shekhinah. It's another way of saying God, but it's only when God is in this world. It's the same word in the Bible. They use the word kavod for that. Kavod Adonai Malayat Mishkan. The glory of God filled the Mishkan. In rabbinic Hebrew, you would say the Shekhinah of God. But then the Kabbalists got hold of that word in the Middle Ages, and they did something very different with it. For the Kabbalists, Shekhinah was the feminine embodiment of God. There were these different manifestations of divinity, the 10 Sfirot. And the most described one was the 10th of the 10 Sfirot, the 10 stages in the emanation of God, which was called Shekhinah. And she was the queen of heaven. She was the bride of God. She was the fulfillment of divine bounty. She received divine bounty from above and passed it on to the lower world. She was the mother of all who live. She is the one who stands at the border between heaven and earth and transmits divine blessing. And a book like the Song of Songs was reread entirely by the Kabbalists to be a love song between the giving and receiving elements, or the male and female elements within God. That, quote, God was taken to be male, and, quote, Shekhinah was taken to be female, and what you wanted to do was bring them together. There was something called the holy marriage, the holy coupling. And the purpose of all our prayers was to bring Shekhinah together with her spouse, to help them to love, to be in love and make love. And that was the new meaning given to the word Shekhinah in the Kabbalah. Later on in Hasidism, that word Shekhinah takes on a different meaning, because they want to say that Hasidism is very close to a certain kind of pantheism, or panentheism. It wants to say the whole world is filled with God's presence. The whole world is filled with the Shekhinah. And really, the Shekhinah is everywhere. Because it's God's presence, Shekhinah is everywhere. And so uniting God and the Shekhinah means uniting everything with God, means uniting all of earth with God, means the union of heaven and earth, or the union of God and the soul. So, so Shekhinah is present everywhere, if only we can discover her. So that's the sense here that Mishkan is a dwelling place for the Shekhinah. I would say in the biblical and the Hasidic sense, it's not about the feminine Shekhinah particularly, though that you can't separate it because that image is there too from the Chadodi and so on. But it is making a home for the divine presence of the world. Making a home for the divine presence. It means the divine presence has to feel at home with you. So we have this image of Abraham with his open tent flaps, and these three angels come along and he welcomes them. Yes. So how would you feel about welcoming angels into your house, or welcoming Elijah into your house, or welcoming the divine presence into your house? Wait, I have to put a tablecloth on the table, take away the cards, or take down the Monopoly game, or whatever it is that's dominating the view in your house before you invite the Shekhinah in. But maybe there are other things you think about that I have to do while inviting the Shekhinah into my house. You're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Since the beginning of the pandemic, much of the Jewish world is relying on devices to gather virtually in prayer. Does this contradict your statement of staying away from our wallets and devices?
Yes, it does. I am not happy with it. Let's hope the pandemic is mostly over for most of us. I think going back to shul is very important. I'm not happy with my friends, and some of them are my very dear friends, in big high-budget synagogues in New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles, who invite you all in to their beautifully conducted services, because I worry about the rabbi of Beth Israel and Oshkosh. Will people ever come back to little Beth Israel of Oshkosh once they have been able to go to let's say the Main Street Synagogue of New York and the Wilshire Boulevard Temple in Los Angeles and whatever it is, which obviously can afford professional musicians the way Oshkosh can't, and have rabbis who are the greatest speakers in the Jewish community nationally, which the rabbi in Oshkosh probably isn't. But the people in Oshkosh would really like to see you again. And you're busy on Zoom. You're busy on Zoom with that great service from San Francisco. And I'm a little bit concerned about what that does to real community. Real community is real people. Remember when it used to be that way? I think we have to get back to it. So I would like to see us getting off the Zoom. I mean, listen, there are shut-ins. My wife lived for a few years in a wheelchair, and I know what it is to not be able to move, or for it to be too impossible for you. So I understand that there are exceptions. And sure, the grandparents in California who can't travel and want to go to their kids' bat mitzvah, of course. But I don't want to see Zooming replace going to synagogue. I spent 50 years trying to tell American Jews that prayer is not a spectator sport. Prayer is not a spectator sport, and on Zoom, it's all spectator. All you can do really on Zoom is watch it. You can't really participate in it, except in rare cases. And so I would like us to continue having classes on Zoom, because it's wonderful we can have this class and people from all over the country who are interested are doing it together. That's terrific. But for tefillah, I would say no. I think we need to go back to real community and make sure we're there for people.
Does being a Mishkan begin with self-compassion? If so, what would that mean?
I think it's a part of it. I don't want to say begin with, but I think it can be. It is an important part of it, because there are some of us who have been through religious stages where religion itself makes us beat ourselves down and say, "Oh, come on, you're not good enough to be a mishkan. You are guilty of so and so, or you have done so and so, or you are really not clean enough, not pure enough to be mishkan because of this that you did," and it keeps us away. It keeps us away from being from opening our hearts that way. Guilt can sometimes keep you shut tight, and that's not good. The Baal Shem Tov understood that very well. He wanted a religion that relieves people from guilt, not burden people with more guilt. And it's one of the reasons I've come to love Hasidism, because it doesn't want to use guilt as a motivation for religion. And so I would say, yes, being kind to yourself, especially about those kinds of issues, those kinds of burdens on the soul that don't let you move forward, I would say is an important part of it. But I don't want it to be mistaken for all of it, because we are too self-preoccupied in our world. And when I talk about making yourself a mishkan, that can be misinterpreted as being all about decorating your own little inner chamber and not dealing with anybody else. And that's not what I have in mind.
One more question here. If it's so that our task is to be a mishkan, how do we cleanse ourselves ongoingly to be ready? Daily, Shabbat is not enough. Friday is 6 days away from Shabbat.
Good. Yes, I think that too. That too is a good question. And I would say we have a lot of ways to do it. You know, the Talmud says a person has to say 100 brachas every day. I would say there are 100 ways to think about being a mishkan during the week all the time. Whether it's the way you talk to your kids in the morning when you're in a hurry, or the way you treat people at work, treat people who work for you, or the way you relate to other drivers, other lousy drivers on the way to work, and how upset and angry and dehumanized you let yourself become. I think all those are part of, hey, I'm supposed to be working on this Mishkan thing. I should remember to keep myself in control. I should remember, Mishkan, you write Mishkan, have a little Mishkan dangling in front of your car mirror instead of a little bunny rabbit. Might be a good reminder to you in that particular situation. So I think it has to do with the whole ethical, spiritual, all the dimensions, ethical, ritual, spiritual. I would say they're all part of that. I think ritual form is also a part of it during the week. Certain reminders, whether it's your mezuzah, or whether you put on tefillin in the morning, or whether you say a bracha after you eat. I think all those things also have to do with that sense of having a series of reminders about this Mishkan project, because we get busy and we forget it. And I think that's exactly what ritual is. It's a series of reminders about this bigger project of building the inner life.
There actually is one other question, Rabbi, if that's okay.
Yep.
If the Mishkan is for all people, not just Jews, is there a model of Shabbat as a portable Mishkan that would work for all people?
Well, as I was saying, I think Shabbat is something we should be missionary about. I think we are living in an incredible age of open, non-hostile contact between the world's religions. Yes. Now there is still competition, you could say, between Christianity and Islam for converts in Africa. Yes, but we Jews have contact for the first time with religions of the Far East, which we never knew at all, except for a tiny Jewish community in India. Judaism never had any contact with Hinduism or Buddhism or Confucianism. What do we have to? What kind of dialogue should we be having with those people? What can we learn from them? We seem to be learning certain things. Yes, meditation seems to be mostly being imported to us back from the East, and that's okay. What do we have to give in that conversation? If we sit at a round table of all the great religious traditions in the world, what do we have to give? What could they learn from Judaism that might be helpful, that might be useful? I think one of those things, one of the top 3 things on that agenda should be Shabbat. Then living in an age of a tremendous, tremendous speeding up of human consciousness. That's what we're going through now. We're going through an age of speeding up of human consciousness. Watch your child or grandchild play those computer games and say how fast those things go. What does it mean to be raising a generation of people who spent their childhoods chasing things that run that fast? We don't know yet. All the labor-saving devices that we thought were going to give us more leisure now turn out just to be there to help us be more productive, to work harder at answering our emails within the first 3 minutes of when they're received. 10 years ago, we were already referring to a letter at the post office as snail mail. Now we don't even think of sending a letter through the mail, through the post office, that might take 2 or 3 days. That's ridiculous. Of course, you don't have to email the person. You can text the person now. You text the person and they're right there. So we constantly have to be available to everybody all the time. And that's exhausting. How many times a day I check my email an awful lot of times a day because I'm not so much a texting person, but then the texts come through too. And to be able to shut it off one day a week and to say, no, I'm going to live with the people around me and I'm going to talk to them and I'm going to see them and touch them and be in a real community and be at a table with my family and take my time and not have to rush back. I think that's a great blessing for the world. I'm not saying they have to worry about whether they carry a handkerchief in their pocket on Shabbos or all kinds of extreme things. Of course not. I don't think the halacha of Shabbos as we have it is made for the world, but I think having a Sabbath, and a Sabbath especially that changes the pace of life and liberates us from devices, I think is an important thing. Now again, liberates us from devices. That's the way you see your grandchildren in California. I'm not saying not to, but doing these things in a reasonable way, I think is a very important thing. I think we have other things to give too, but I think Shabbat is right near the top of the list.
No more questions coming in.
Okay, let's move on. Second text. We are now going to Parsha Ki Tisa, the next Parsha. And you may remember we have 2 Parshiot of building the Mishkan, Teruma and Tetzaveh. And then we have Ki Tisa, which interrupts that because we have here the famous story of the golden calf and then Moses getting the second tablets. So the pasuk is, the verse is, Psal lecha shnei luchot avalim karishonim. Excuse me, let me remind you of the narrative in case you don't quite remember it. We were just on Sunday at the top of Mount Sinai. That was Shavuot. We received the Torah on Shavuot. That's not according to the Torah, but according to the rabbis. We received the Torah on Shavuot. Moses was up there. Moses brought down the 2 tablets on Shavuot. He saw the people. No, I'm sorry. Forgive me. I've got it wrong. Moses went up the mountain on Shavuot. He was on the mountain for 40 days. Remember, didn't eat food, didn't drink water, was learning the Torah for the whole 40 days. Moses comes down 40 days after Shavuot. That happens to be the 7th day of Tammuz, 17th day of Tammuz, which is a fast day. It's a fast day because of the breaching of the inner city of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, second temple. But the rabbis say, no, it's a fast day because that's the day when Moses came down, saw the Israelites dancing around the golden calf, and smashed the tablets. He then dealt with the punishment of the people, the Levites slaughtering many who had opposed, who had followed the golden calf. And then he went back up. He went back up on Rosh Chodesh Elul, first day of Elul, and came back down 40 days later with the second tablets. That 40th day is Yom Kippur. It's 30 days of Elul and 10 days from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. That's Yom Kippur. So Yom Kippur is the day of the giving of the second tablets. So the verse is, make yourself 2 tablets like the first ones. Now we'll move up to the English. Make yourself 2 tablets like the first. Carve 2 stone tablets on your own, like the former ones. The first tablets had to be smashed. Human beings could not accept the Torah dictated entirely from above. Because of the first tablets, it says, God says, I will make the tablets. Haluchot ma'aseh Elohim hema, v'michtav michtav Elohim. The luchot were the work of the hands of God, and the writing was divine. Both the tablet forming and the writing was done by God. Human beings could not accept the Torah dictated entirely from above. Tablets made by God and inscribed with God's own writing were too much for humanity to bear. The message of freedom was squashed in them by an excess of awe. The message of freedom, remember, the essential message is freedom. Anochi, I am the Lord your God who brought you forth out of Egypt, out of the house of slaves. It's about liberation. It's about being free. But that message was squashed by so much awe. Tablets made by God, written by God. God had to learn that from the terrible ordeal of the golden calf. God learned something from the golden calf. He saw that people couldn't handle it that way. Now, convinced by Moses not to give up on Israel, you remember Moses pleads with him. When he goes up on Rosh Chodesh Elul, Moses stays up 40 days this time, not receiving the Torah, but arguing with God not to destroy Israel. God wants to destroy them. God says to Moses, let me go. I'll make you a new people. I'll create a new people out of you. And Moses refused. He says, if you're going to kill them, you got to kill me first. He puts his life on the line for Israel. And now, convinced by Moses not to give up on Israel, God is ready to start again. This time God says, you make the tablets, and I'll do the writing. So lecha, you make the tablets, and I'll write on them. Religion needs to emerge from a joint enterprise between divine and human creativity. We have to have a place in creating the religion. We write the poetry. We write the music. God gives it the spiritual content, but we are part of the creativity. We make the tablets. Yom Kippur is our annual commemoration of the giving of the second tablets. Moses went back up to Sinai on the first day of Elul. He pleaded for Israel and worked on the carving and negotiated for Israel's forgiveness for 40 days and came down with them on Yom Kippur. That's why there should be lots of singing and joy in the true Hasidic Yom Kippur. We've been forgiven again. Every time that repetition, the repetition is the repetition of God's forgiving Israel after the golden calf. Hey, it's a great day. We've been forgiven again. That's what Yom Kippur is. It's not a day of sin, it's a day of forgiveness. Rosh Hashanah is a day of judgment. Yom Kippur is a day of forgiveness. So we've been forgiven again as we were after the golden calf. Think of it as a celebration of a renegotiated marriage. They got married too young, God and Israel, or whoever you know. They got married too young and lived in a world in which he dictated all the terms. She was not prepared to live that way, and the marriage failed. You might even say she was not able to live that way, and she betrayed the marriage. Like the prophet Hosea tells us. God says to me, you want to know what I feel like? Go marry a prostitute. Right? She was not prepared to live that way, and the marriage failed. But instead of divorcing, they found a great marriage counselor named Moses, who helped them renegotiate the terms anew. So they come back and redeclare their vows. They're going to start again. This time it's going to be an egalitarian marriage. You make the tablets, and I'll write on them. Let us join in this celebration of the remarriage of the Blessed Holy One and the community of Israel. Now we can go on, knowing that God is with us in our shared process of carving and inscribing the Luchot, of creating Torah. We'll keep carving, we say in the celebration of forgiveness. You keep inscribing. Write them on the tablets of your heart. Katveim al luach libecha. So Yom Kippur clears the path to Simchat Torah, to a new receiving of Torah. So that's a Yom Kippur I would like to see us create more of. A Yom Kippur of celebration of forgiveness, and Yom Kippur as a renegotiated marriage. We have made it through a really tough period of this marriage, and it's time to renegotiate. You might say that as a post-Holocaust Jew. You might say that as a Jew living in the modern world. As a Jew who was once oppressed by authority, as a Jewish woman who was once excluded from the tradition. You might say we want this marriage to continue, but we have to negotiate new terms so that it's more mutual. And Yom Kippur is a celebration of that new marriage contract. So let's stop there and see where that all takes. You're going to have two interesting conversations today, I think.
I'm waiting for questions to come in. Everybody has great questions. Here we go. Let me just copy this. Okay. You said Shabbat is one of the top 3 things we can share with other religions. What are the other 2?
I was afraid somebody would ask that. As soon as I said it that way, somebody's going to ask that question. I would say the other 2 are Tselem Elohim, that every living human being is the image of God. And I know that notion has been carried into the Western world already in a certain way, but I think we insist on it. It's why we have no icons in the synagogue, because we are all icons, because each of us is the divine image. And every life is the divine image, every person is the divine image. That doesn't answer all the questions. You can believe that that every human being is a divine image and still have differing views, especially with regard to both abortion and end-of-life issues. Those are complicated questions, but the image of God, the human being the image of God, is the place from which those issues have to be resolved, I think, have to be talked about, and other issues too. War and peace, and treatment of prisoners, and atrocities, and all kinds of things. What does it mean to defile the divine image? And how does one restore the divine image in people? So I think that's very important. And the other, I would say, is the ability to keep ancient forms and a living tradition of freedom to reinterpret them. We have preserved very, very ancient rituals going back long before biblical times. You walk into a synagogue on Sukkot and see people parading around the altar, waving their palm branches. That's a very, very ancient form. I think eating matzot is probably a very ancient spring rite. These were forms that were there before the Bible. The Bible took them and reshaped them completely. The rabbis reshaped them again. The medievals reshaped them again. And the idea that you keep an old form and give it new meaning is I think, something we are particularly good at. And the freedom to reinterpret. the freedom to reinterpret the text. Lev, I don't know if you were around when we still had our neighbors next door, Andover Newton, and still had some joint classes with them. The Protestant theological students who studied with our rabbinical students were always shocked by the freedom the rabbinical students felt to reinterpret scripture. They said, wait a minute, you can't do that. And these were not fundamentalist liberal Protestants, but they'd never heard of this sort of freedom of a constant, ongoing, creative reinterpretation. Shivim panim la Torah. The Torah has 70 faces, and you can keep revealing a new one. I think that's a very important statement of cultural preservation and creativity. And I think we have that mix in a very extraordinary way. And other nations need to learn to do that. I wish Muslim jurists could reinterpret the Quran more freely. I wish they had maintained. They had once had some of that, but they lost it in later Islam. And I wish they had maintained some of that freedom to reinterpret. They and we would be much better off, etc. Okay, that was a side question.
Without Moses to negotiate for us, how can we convince others to renegotiate more mutuality? Or how can we create circumstances for Moses-like intervention in the areas in which we need tikkun?
Well, there is a Zohar statement that says there is a spreading forth of Moses in every generation. All of us have a little bit of Moses in us. So I don't want to say that there is no Moses. But listen, you have to take particular situations. And you have to obviously count your battles and decide which ones you want to fight. But I think there are places where we can do it. I mentioned the need for Jews to identify with another people that's been redeemed from slavery, who are our next door neighbors in the United States. A people not only that's been redeemed from slavery and is still struggling 150 years later to make their redemption real and complete, but also a people that survived slavery partly because they were so inspired by our story. And so we can't quite say we have nothing to do with this. This is not a Jewish issue. I think our need to identify with that community and give it help in overcoming the effects of slavery is a very real part of what we have to do, not least because we're enjoying the fruits of an America that got so wealthy on their backs. But I'm not going to give that speech. I think you've all heard it probably from your own minds and consciences that we are enjoying the fruits of that America that their work helped create. So I think that's an example of. And we need leadership who are willing to do it. Heschel was such a leader, obviously. I think we lack great leaders in American Jewish life today. I think the two great tzaddikim of American Jewish life in the post-war years were Heschel and Wiesel. And there's nobody quite in that position today. And I think we need such people to emerge. Yeah. I don't think we need to wait for them, but I think we need them to emerge.
Next question.
Sure.
If Moses convinced God to forgive us, does that mean that God learns and can learn from us? Or does it mean that the story at Sinai teaches us the importance of forgiveness in our own lives?
Yes and yes. Certainly, let's go to the second part first, because it's so wonderfully said. Yes, you want to be forgiven, be forgiving. It's as simple as that. That's a message of one of the great Hasidic teachers, the Rabbi of Chernobyl, in fact, who says that it says in the Talmud these 13 attributes of faith that we recite over and over again on Yom Kippur. Hashem Hashem Kevarachum V'Chanun. He says, the Talmud says, if you do this before me, I will forgive you. And he says, the Talmud says, if you do this, not if you recite this, not if you say this, it says, if you do this, so in order to be forgiven, be more forgiving. In order to receive divine compassion, be more compassionate, etc., etc. You walk in the ways of God, of course. Now remind me the first part of the question.
If Moses convinced God to forgive us, does that mean that God learns and
Yes, does God
learns?
learn? Well, I go back to maybe the most powerful teacher I ever had was Professor Yochanan Mufs, who taught at JTS many, many years ago. He lived, but he was ill for many years. I was fortunate to be a student before he was ill, and a very dynamic teacher. And he used to say, think of the Torah as a play, and or a novel. The chief character is God, and this is all about God's learning to live with these creatures God created, called human beings. And yes, God learns. God learns from the flood. God says, Nichamti, I regret that I made these human beings. I'm going to destroy them. But then God doesn't destroy them and comes out learning something. I think God learned something. God learned something from Moses here. I think God learns from Abraham when Abraham bargains him down and almost gets him to forgive Sodom. And then Abraham backs down. I think that's an experience that we learn from and that God learns from. God as a character in the story. God as a character in the story learns from. Now, is there a God who learns? If you ask me as a theological question, not as a literary, what does the Bible say in question, but if you ask me as a believing Jew, a theological question, that's a somewhat different story. And there I have to say, yes, God as a character in the narrative definitely learns. What would I mean by God learning? What would we mean by God learning? Since I believe that God is what is, was, will be, and contains all and is all knowledge is there in the one, past, present, and future all at once. God knows all because God is all. And yet, each of us contributes to that. My favorite story by Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who was a great storyteller, is called The Story of the Portrait of the King. Some of you may remember it if you have read my Seek My Face. The whole Seek My Face was a comment on the portrait of the king. So at the end of our lives, each of us brings back a new portrait of the king. The king in the story has a portrait gallery. He has portraits of all the kings in the world. But there's one empty space on his gallery wall. Because there's a certain king, he says, I couldn't get a picture of anywhere. And he sends his wise men into the world to bring back a picture of that king. It turns out that's another picture of God. Each of us who is an image of God brings back to God a new picture of God's self at the end of our life. And that's a picture of God with all the wrinkles of all the suffering and all the joys and everything we've gone through in our lives. That's a new learning for God. It's a new picture of God on God's wall. God as that particular human being. God is manifest in that particular human being. So in that sense, yes, I think there is a divine learning. Each of us contributes something to the wholeness and oneness that is God. In that sense, you could say God learns from us.
Is there a parallel between the concept of having a portable Mishkan and our constantly recarving the tablets?
Trying to take the two teachings and put them together, huh? The portable Mishkan and the recarved tablets. The Mishkan has, we said, Baby Yitzhak says, and I think rightly, the Mishkan has to be made differently in every generation. Is that the same as recarving the tablets? It might be two metaphors for something very similar. Remember, we recarve the tablets, but God writes the same message on them. The Ten Commandments, our interpretation of them may have changed, but that's from our end. But the demand of those Ten Commandments are still there. They still say, do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness. They still say those same things. But the recarving, yes, the way we reshape our understanding, just what does adultery mean? What does murder mean? There are people who are saying abortion is murder, for example, and how do we feel about that? What does murder mean? What does murder mean in our wild, gun freaked out country? What does murder mean on the West Bank when done by Israeli soldiers or settlers? What does murder mean, etc., etc.? I think there are lots of questions about the Ten Commandments in the recarved tablets, but the essential demand is still there, still has to push us. It can't be we just freely, we don't rewrite them, we recarve them. I think that's the way to say it, yes.
Do you have any thoughts on why the idea of Yom Kippur as a celebratory holiday has not gained traction outside of the Hasidic world? While understanding that Hasidism in general is more celebratory than traditional Judaism, this seems to be an extreme case of opposite approaches in that non-Hasidic Judaism experiences Yom Kippur as the most solemn day of the year and is in large measure centered on restriction. For example, not eating.
Yes, some of it, of course, is biblical. Not eating is biblical. It says, you shall afflict your souls on that day. It doesn't say not eating, it says that you shall afflict your souls. But fasting is a very early and universal part of Yom Kippur. But other parts of Yom Kippur are very much covered by the Ashkenazic experience of martyrdom, suffering, and tragedy. You look at the text of Avinu Malkeinu. Do it, if not for our sake, do it for your sake. Do it for the sake of those who went through fire and water for your name. Do it for the sake of our martyred ancestors. The idea of having the Eila Ezker, I read, the deaths of the 10 martyrs. The constant repetition of the lists of sins, the short list and the long list. They're in each of the amidot of the day, both silent and repeated. So it's a very big concentration on sin, atonement, guilt, martyrdom. That's especially true in the Ashkenazic tradition. You look at the real, I don't mean the Hasidic Sephardic, but the real Sephardic communities. There isn't quite that same amount of heaviness about it. There's somewhat more celebration. So I think it's both. It is both. It is both original to Yom Kippur, that it is a day of affliction, and that it is a day of destroying sin. But it's also, I think, was made much heavier by the very long and very tragic experience of Ashkenazic history.
Following up on that, another question asks, can you say a bit about the Hasidic understanding of Yom Kippur and its place on the larger timeline? I imagine the questioner means the larger Jewish timeline, but.
Well, I don't know if you mean the historical timeline or the timeline of the year. I'll answer with regard to both very briefly. The historical timeline, of course, Hasidism was a very late movement in the tradition. We're talking about an 18th century Hasidism, which in the history of Judaism, of course, is very recent. And this is a kind of innovative Judaism that the Baal Shem Tov and his followers created, let's say in the 1770s, 1780s, and became very popular throughout Eastern Europe. And I would say, aside from Lithuania, really conquered most of the East European Jewish communities by the second quarter of the 19th century. It really became the dominant form. Now, each Hasidic group was somewhat different. Some were more into this celebratory Yom Kippur, some less so, because asceticism is a very hard thing to beat down when people have a tendency to it. So it didn't happen overnight, it didn't happen universally. But there definitely is that kind of Yom Kippur in Hasidism, which is especially more, they didn't change the prayer so much, but much more joyous music, and a very different feeling, especially toward Nila, toward the end of it. There is a sense that you really have completed the work that you were there to do. It's meant to be a spiritual purification, and you come out purified, as opposed to just coming out hungry and bored. And so that's really how it's supposed to work. And now, in terms of the timeline of the year, I think it's interesting. I said something here about Hasidism, about Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur clears the way for Simchat Torah, which is to say, being creative again, creating Torah. You see, Simchat Torah is an invented holiday. We didn't have Simchat Torah until, you don't find any evidence of it until the Middle Ages, until 12th, 13th century. It's a new custom. The Zohar quotes it as a relatively new custom, new practice. Not mentioned in the Talmud, not mentioned in the Torah, of course. And I think the reason for it is, if you look at the Jewish calendar, I think I may have mentioned this, I'm not sure previously, look at the Jewish calendar, we have these two sacred seasons that are about the same length. We just completed a sacred season that's famously of 51 days. Because from the second day of Yom Kippur, of Pesach, we start counting 50 days till Shavuot. So it's 51 days from the beginning of Pesach till the end of Shavuot. How does this sacred season end? With a great bang, you receive the Torah. Then we have another sacred season, begins with Rosh Chodesh Elul and goes through Simchat Torah. That's 53 days. It's almost the same. And that's a sacred season that begins with preparing, then the great holidays, but then how does it end? Shmini Atzeret, a very uncolorful holiday. Stay with me one more day. Sukkot is over, but please don't leave yet. That's sort of what Shmini Atzeret is about. So the medievals created Simchat Torah, so that season would also end with a great bang, the way Shavuot is. First season, you receive the Torah for this, and then go forth into the profane months of the summer, and then you renew the Torah. You promise new joy in Torah, new creativity in Torah, and then you go through the months of the winter until Pesach, sort of with this message to keep you going. So I think you need to clear the deck for that. And Yom Kippur clears the deck of all the old guilt, of all the old things hanging around to keep you from creating this new Torah. And then Simchas Torah is there prepared by Yom Kippur.
One more question just came in. How can we ensure that we leave the sacred 51-day season thoroughly changed and not fall once again back towards our golden calf tendencies?
Well, you can never be sure. That's the point. You can never be absolutely sure. You have to work on it. The 51-day season is about how you have to work your way up to Shavuot on your own. On Pesach, you were completely liberated. You were taken up to the 50th gate, but then you're plunked down at the beginning again. You count the days of Sphira to prepare for Shavuot, to build up toward Shavuot on your own, to learn that you have to have the strength to do it. And that's true after Shavuot as well. We have our daily struggles. We have this building the Mishkan. We're back in the building the Mishkan business. And building the Mishkan is something you do every day. And there are days when you succeed better at it and days when it's harder. And then you have to go back and do it again. There is no easy answer to that question. How can we assure that we will not fall back into the golden calf? Because we have so many golden calves in our society. The golden calves of our society are very blatant. They live in Hollywood. They live on the TV screen. They live in sports figures. They live in all these so-called celebrities, whom I try to avoid doing anything about. And the commercial culture, the advertising culture are all geared. And of course, social media, needless to say, have taken away much of our liberty also, because they're sort of telling us who our cultural heroes are supposed to be. You belong to this team, and therefore your cultural heroes are this guy and this woman, and you can't appreciate the other one because they're on the other team. I think these are all very dangerous forms of idolatry in our society. We don't have. It's not like we have graven images, and I'm not worried about Jews worshiping icons, about Jews worshiping Russian icons or Tibetan statues. I'm much more worried about Jews worshiping some of these other things. I think we Jews particularly have a big idol. Our biggest idol, I would say, is called success. And we worship the God of success much too much. We were such a successful immigrant group in this country, yes? We were the immigrant group that came to America best equipped to succeed. And we succeeded tremendously. We succeeded beyond our expectations. But we were a little bit too driven by success. So the good kid who doesn't get into a great college doesn't get rewarded as well as the one who gets into the Ivy League. The person who's just a householder in the community and doing his share to support the community doesn't get praised because, well, she's not earning $400,000 a year. She's not a doctor, or she's not a PhD. And I think that we have to be more careful about the false gods of success that are the biggest idols that I see in our particular community these days. Okay, are we winding up, or we have another one?
I think so. I think that's we've got to every question.
Few minutes early tonight. That's okay. Thank you all for being here, and see you back for number 7. I want to say how very gratifying to me it is to see that our numbers have been very steady. We started with about 68, 69 people, I think, the first time, and I see the same number of you coming. I don't know if you're all exactly the same people. Most of you probably are, and it's really wonderful to have that reassurance of so many of you staying with us. So
and also, just so you know, there's plenty of people that, because of time change, are just listening on the recordings too, very regularly.
That's great. Okay, terrific. So great to see you all, and see you next week.
See you in a week. Thanks all.